Welcome to Directionally Correct, a People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott. And today's guest, Deborah Weiss, Director of the Workforce Science Project at Northwestern University School of Law. Hey, Directionally Correct fans. If you're looking to stay connected to the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, watch our videos on YouTube, or listen to the podcast on your app of choice. This podcast is dedicated to you to help educate and entertain you on how to effectively do people analytics. We are a listener-supported podcast, so please consider becoming a patron. If you'd like to support the podcast by becoming a patron, you can find a link to sign up in the show notes or at patron.podbean.com/directionallycorrect. Thanks for being a listener. All opinions are our own and do not reflect those of any other organization. Deborah, it's really great to have you on the podcast today. You actually have the honor or the privilege or, I don't know, the disdain, let's call it, of being the longest serving person who I've been trying to get to be on the podcast, who we finally got. You were one of the first people I reached out to when we started this because of all the cool work that you're doing at the Workforce Science Project at Northwestern University School of Law and TALREOS and the WORRC project and all of that. But I'm super excited for you to be here. What made you change your mind? What made you want to join us after all this time?
Well, I want to thank you for your patience. And I want to say that it was not disdain, it was humility. It was two sides. Humility in the sense that we're going to be talking today about a very specific project. And I wanted to be sure the project was in a place where we were really proud of it and could say, this is something we've got. We've got a minimum viable product here. We don't just have a dream. So we're finally at that point.
No, I'm delighted. I was never offended. I've always known that your heart was in the right place. And so I appreciate your humility. Before we get into it, I wanted to talk, since we have talked a lot about remote work on the podcast.
Yeah.
And I believe you're based in Austin, but Northwestern University is in Chicago. How does that all work out? And how do you manage the back and forth with all of that in terms of your day job?
It's incredibly kind of Northwestern to do that. And the person who originally invited me to start this project was Matt Spitzer, and he was willing to be flexible. And it was, at first, I commuted a lot, which wasn't great because my kids were kind of young at the time. But then COVID normalized this remote work. And so now I basically don't come up that often. And in fact, it's set a precedent. There are a couple of other projects at the center. I think one of the other people is actually in Africa. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's quite the commute.
It is quite a commute. He doesn't come that often. And it's easier with Zoom, and it's easier because I'm not teaching.
Absolutely. Give us a little background. What is the Workforce Science Project? How did it start? How did you get involved? And just like, why is it important? Like, when I think of, when I first heard about it, I was like, a bunch of lawyers want to talk about this stuff. Like, why is it relevant to labor, to people analytics, to employment decisions? And kind of just fill us in as to what's important.
Can I give a little personal background first? That may set the stage for it. So I actually started out, to make this even stranger, doing tax, which you would think is even further away. It's like not the part of law that is even most adjacent. But it has turned out to be really, really useful to this project. Because the thing about tax is it is obsessively detail-oriented. It is incredibly technical, and you need a lot of patience for it, but it's got really big hidden policy payoffs that if you're willing to slog through it, you can get to really important questions. And so I think starting in tax was actually a great play, turned out to be very, very useful for the role I play in this project. However, that said, although I enjoyed tax, I like the people element also. So I kind of gradually drifted. I started out doing just, pure hardcore tax, drifted towards pensions, which has more of a people policy, and then ended up doing really what you would call employment law. But law schools these days are not, for the most part, what we used to call, I don't know if people outside the profession know this word, but they're not doctrine-oriented. People at good law schools don't write papers about what the law says. There's a lot of empirical work. I've done some empirical work myself, a lot of numbers-driven work. So it was actually a kind of a natural fit. And the center I'm at is basically all empirical, and it's all interdisciplinary work between lawyers, people in the business school, and large businesses. So it actually fit in better than you think.
Yeah. Well, so again, what is the Workforce Science Project? How'd you get involved? Where did it form, and what is its mandate?
Matt Spitzer, who was the director at the time, and I sort of came up with it together. That is, he knew what I was interested in at the time. And the Center for Law, Business, and Economics has this mandate to sort of do public policy work with a lot of outreach and a very strong conference focus. That's sort of one of our things. We do sort of two things. We midwife research, but a lot of the way we do it is through conferences, because conferences are a way of getting people from different backgrounds together. So the original mandate was, let's see if we can get more academic industry collaboration on workforce research. And that was how we organized the first few conferences. And then we stumbled across, well, we didn't stumble across it. We were really lucky. We met the visionary Dean Carter, who at the time was CHRO of a company some of you may have heard of called Sears, which still existed at the time. And he had this idea, he and Ian O'Keefe, who was working for him at the time, sort of taught us more about what people analytics was. And it was a field that barely existed then. And Dean and Ian were practically the only people at old line companies doing it, I guess primarily germinated in the tech industry, and convinced us rightly that there was this need for a conference that really focused on the somewhat more technical ends. They said there are a lot of good conferences around, actually fewer than there are now, but there are good conferences. They said you are in a unique position to get one that's sort of more technically oriented, that says, if you come in this room, be prepared not to start at the beginning, to start at the advanced level. So they had this great idea. They helped us put it together, and it's grown.
Yeah. So what is that conference? I'll say it's TALREOS, but what does TALREOS stand for?
That is a funny story. It started out as Talent Analytics Leadership Roundtable. And then in order to get more of the policy focus in, which is important to us, we have a strong focus on economic opportunity as a policy, the policy we're most interested in workforce. And so we thought, well, how can we make something you can actually say out of this? And so it's the Talent Analytics Leadership Roundtable and Economic Opportunity Summit. But needless to say, we don't publicize that because it's just too much of a mouthful. So we just hope you can remember TALREOS.
Yeah, I always tell people TALREOS, they're like, what does that stand for? I'm like, I don't know.
You shouldn't. It's like one of those things that you could be lost in the mists of time. Would we do it the same way again? Possibly not, but people can remember it enough. And this way we didn't have to totally jettison the name we started out with.
Yeah. Well, I do have to say thank you to you. You've been a early and longtime supporter of the podcast, and you had us, I believe it was either our first or our second live episode we ever had was at TALREOS. We recorded with Nick Bremner a few years ago, and you've offered for us to do it a few more times. We always, one thing or another ever comes up, but I think TALREOS is a fantastic conference, and I believe this episode will come out maybe a week, 2-3 weeks before the conference happens this year. So really exciting. It should be really excellent. Anything that people should look forward to who are attending TALREOS, many of which are listeners of the podcast?
Well, I think we have an amazing lineup this year. I'm afraid to start naming names because I'm going to leave people out. To your website, www.talreos.org. But then I'll also say a couple of things. One of the cool things is we have grown from something very small to something mid-size. Not large, and we don't want to be large, but mid-size, 150 to 200. And one of the things that makes it nice is that it's interactive and it's people who all have something important to contribute. And as we got bigger, that got trickier to maintain. And so we are now adding a different component, which we're experimenting with this year, which is to say a peer group sessions that are more heavily facilitated. They're not just speaker oriented, they're facilitated. And so we're actually, thanks to Lightcast, Elizabeth's going to be doing one of them, and we're hope that that's going to get some of the interactive energy that maybe we were at risk of losing as we grew.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I remember Dean spoke last year and told the conference to quit growing. It sounds like you didn't take any of his advice. So
No, we're stabilized. We're going to stabilize on that side. I think 200 is like the absolute maximum. It's capped. It's invitation only, and it's capped. And I think I don't think we want to grow at this point.
So let's switch gears here for a minute. And again, this is why I've been constantly pestering you about the podcast. But the backstory is there's an ability or this notion that people analytics or HR metrics more broadly should adopt a principle similar to like the generally accepted accounting principles, the gap measures that exist in accounting and in finance, that we need to have a set of standards by which all companies measure themselves. And you could use that for a variety of purposes. Why haven't we done that? Like, and I'm talking about the backstory because I know you know a lot about the backstory. And then what's the wisdom for doing it? What's the wisdom against doing that? And then let's kind of work our way up to the present.
That's a fabulous question. There are that question is being approached from a couple of very different angles, and the worlds are totally non-intersecting. You have on the one hand the things that everybody outside the people analytics profession knows about, the human capital reporting movement. And that's primarily driven by what until recently has been called ESG. I personally think that we need to abandon a brand that has become too dangerous, and I think we should start calling it non-financial reporting, which is more accurate anyway, because it's the entire range of non-financial reporting. It includes human capital, it includes environmental, it includes governance, it's all the things that you can't get in accounting. So the non-financial reporting movement is where a lot of the human capital reporting energy has come from. The problem is those people aren't experts. They are, at best, they are people who have top level questions that are the right questions that they want to be answered.
So they don't know what they're talking about. They like call it spade a spade. They don't know what they're talking about. They hear to measure things, but they don't necessarily know how to do it effectively.
Yeah, well, and they don't even know what questions to ask. So I went to a well-meaning convening the other day, or a couple of months ago, about people who were saying, making the list of things that they were trying to measure even longer, like and this is just even a statute that was a bill that's been introduced in Congress multiple times by a couple of members of Congress for whom I have tremendous respect, but it asks for things like measures of employee autonomy. Now, I mean,
what is that?
Exactly, right. This is like not a thing. And so somebody who, I have no idea where it came from, but this is an actual bill that has been introduced in Congress 3 times now. So the people who are thinking about external reporting, thank you for saying it and not making me say it, don't know what they're doing. Or a few of them do. There are a few people who do know what they're doing and at least reduce the questions to the right list. But even they don't get how hard it is. Then at the other end of the spectrum, we have what's going on inside corporations, where we have these incredibly smart people analytics teams developing their own approaches to coming up with more and more rigorous reporting. But the problem is, first of all, everybody's reinventing the wheel. It's ridiculously duplicative for everybody to try to come up with something that could be done collectively and solved once. In addition, there is no one absolute right way of doing it. And so if it's not standardized, it's of limited use. So our goal was to solve that problem.
Well, so like some of the smart people that have had a perspective on this, I mean, I always say people analytics is kind of built on the shoulders of giants, and they're, people like Jack Fitzins who looked at their, decades and decades ago and really started the push for standardizing metrics, formed the Saratoga Institute, all of that. I know you've talked about Lori Bassey, another great person. There's been a lot of really heavy hitters that have been involved over the years in the ISO standards. Can you talk about kind of, again, all of those and like what's great about them, but what were the stumbling blocks that they run into?
So the stumbling blocks were that these efforts started. It's a terrible fate to have a great idea too soon. And so this was a great idea that started at a time. It was only 10 or 15, it was 15 years ago, but that's like eons in the evolution of HR tech and people analytics. And so you have all these sort of previous generation, old school CHROs who came from a totally different tradition of HR, one that was sort of compliance based, maybe people based, but not tech or analytics driven. They didn't like the standards. And I'll give you two interpretations depending on how generous you're feeling.
Sure.
If you're feeling generous, the reason they didn't like standards was the reasons I just gave you, that it just didn't fit their background. They weren't tech people. They weren't data people. They just came from a different tradition, and so they didn't see the point. The more cynical point of view, and of course, people are different. It could be one explanation for some and one explanation for another, is that they didn't want accountability. Because as soon as you start measuring things, they're going to have to start answering for them.
Yep.
So that was a problem that they ran into, and there was serious obstacles. I told you the story that I'm going to give in a slightly abbreviated form for public consumption, but a number of them were called into conferences and told, basically, you'll never work in this town again if you don't stop this work. So there was serious opposition. It wasn't just inertia, it was actual opposition. Now, 15 years has been an incredibly long time. And I think you've had two things that have just changed everything. The first is that tech companies weren't having any of this. Tech companies started fresh. They didn't have any of this old baggage. And they're all completely data and analytics driven. So we all know Google is like an extraordinarily pivotal organization in the history of people analytics. And they weren't about to have a non-data driven function as important as people. So the tech firms just completely upset the apple cart. And then you have the growth of HR tech, which makes this all easier. So as the technology gets better and you start having these leading firms, all of a sudden people analytics and measurement become more acceptable. And that made standardization seem more reasonable.
Let me go on a quick tangent really quick.
Please.
Kind of to the point you made about there's like a generational shift in HR leadership in the past. And one of the things that people analytics teams, I mean, you see surveys on it every year where they say, what are the top things that people analytics needs to be focusing on? And always in the top 5, sometimes number 1 is building capability in HR people for understanding data and analysis. And so I've been interviewed a few times to say, how are we going to do this effectively? And I always say, we're not. and the reason why I say that is because I say it's a generational problem.
It is.
Is that there's a generation of leaders in HR that came up in a time before this existed. And until they age out of being HR leaders, you're never going to change how they go about doing HR, because it's, what got you here won't get you there. This is not what got them there. And so that they're not going to change. However, every day, new leaders come into the scene that came into HR when this was a prevalent topic, and they're more and more assuming leadership roles. So every day, the scales start to tip in the favor of the people who understand this stuff natively. You don't have to educate them because they already got educated into this years and years ago. And so I always say, we're never going to build the capability. What's going to happen is you're just going to see a demographic shift in who leads HR. And once that happens, this is really when you're going to see the primacy of people analytics and data and HR metrics really coming to bear.
I think that's absolutely correct. The generational shift is really important. But I think we're closer. We're actually not that far away. I think, the progress is mind-boggling. I mean, surely, would you agree that the improvement is just visible every year?
No. I think it's like a tug of war. Is like, sometimes you make the progress and then it goes back and then, people are winning, but we haven't fully gotten to the point where it's like, okay, we can let go of the rope. the tug of war is over. And I long for that day personally. But I'll say that I want to come back though. ISO.
Yep.
There's been some standards that have been launched in the last few years. Why aren't they good enough?
I think there are two answers to that. One is that ISO is what Lee Webster and Lori Bassi did. And they were the target of the interference by the old school CHRO. And unfortunately, they inflicted some mortal wounds on it, that they just scared off too many good people. Lee was able to save the project and get the actual human capital reporting metrics released. And it continues, and there are good people working on it. And I think it's the project, but it's
not for a lack of trying. It's not for a lack of talent. There's really great people involved. I know quite a few of them. You know, quite a few of them. They've been doing, they've been trying to do good work, but it's not because, they're not trying hard enough.
Yeah. Again, I have tremendous respect for ISO, and I was part of it for a while. I was part of it just because Lee and his colleagues needed help. And so I sat through these boring procedural meetings just so that when people tried to block it, I was there to say, no, we got to keep going with this. I think the other problem is a structural problem with ISO itself that apparently is not specific to human capital standards. It is a very, very bureaucratic model of decision making.
Yep.
And are you familiar? Have you run into this about ISO before? Are you familiar enough?
Well, I've done some research into it, not in the human capital space, but been governed by it in some other spaces in my career. And frankly, it just, like, my viewpoint on it is just very basic, which is it seems more prevalent in Europe than in the United States.
Yes, definitely.
And until you can get kind of a universal measure, it's not as helpful to me. And whether something's more regional in nature or more bureaucratic in nature, which it is.
Huh. And have you run into the process problem being an issue?
I've seen it more, again, this is going way back, but doing some work in the health and safety space. And there's a lot of ISO stuff in that space. And again, it's all people's hearts are in the right place. It's just, it becomes sometimes more of a check the box initiative than something that is adding value to organizations. And I think we both believe that, some of this type of data, what you can measure can be truly transformative. And I think it sometimes doesn't allow for that by how, check the box it becomes.
Well, and it is just so procedure heavy. And I'm obviously, as a lawyer, I respect procedure a lot. The problem is in the early stages of a process, it's impediment. A process is what you want when you've got something mature. It's an impediment in early phases. And so, as I said, that's why I had to sit through these boring meetings just to be a veto when somebody was going to try to stop stuff. So again, great respect to ISO. I hope they continue to do work, but I think there's between the history and the structure, there's room for us.
All right. I made you go through this laborious history lesson to get us to the current moment.
Yeah.
All right. And so let's talk about work. And I'm not talking about WORK. I'm talking about WORQ.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We have changed the name so many times. I will have to go through this if you can bear with me. The full name is the Workforce Reporting Consortium, which sort of, if you say WRC, is work. So that's easy enough. And what we do is work principles. That's our output. So it's Workforce Reporting Consortium principles. The tricky part, however, is the exact abbreviation. And it turns out, and I will not bore you all with this, but that trademark law is a really horrible, complicated thicket. And even if you're a lawyer, I just don't get it.
You're a lawyer.
I don't get it. I have such respect for trademark lawyers because it makes sense to me. We were very lucky we have pro bono firm that's helping us pro bono, because there's no way I could have done this without, they did it. I didn't. So what we ended up with, our abbreviation is capital W, small o, small r, capital R, C. And it's looks okay. It's at least distinctive. The reason for it is it's distinctive. If it's not distinctive enough, you can't trademark it, is what it comes down to. So it's distinctive. You can say it. It's work. And it's a compromise.
All right. Well, what is it? And how is it going to help in terms of the standardization of human capital measures?
So what it has always been in the past is an incredibly informal group of us. I do it in my spare time. It's not part of my day job, but getting together and coming up with standards. And our basic work process is I write a draft, and then I throw it out to these unbelievably talented groups, a group of people who just rip it up. And it often ends up looking nothing like what I did. But the concept is you start with a straw man draft, and that allows people to focus and say everything that's wrong. And then we keep iterating. So this has all been done very informally. And I think that's what's helped. I gather, people have said this is basically how agile work processes work, that it's essentially the same idea. You try to have people who are committed and serious, and you iterate a lot, but you don't have too many formal rules. So that's how we've proceeded up to now. We now actually are finally a nonprofit corporation. So we exist as a separate entity, and we have released, in a sense, I'll tell you what the qualification is in a second, our first draft of part 1. And part 1 is the really basic stuff. Turnover, head count, who are you going to cover? The stuff that's nitty gritty and boring, but really critical if you're going to get comparisons. Because if you're not comparing the same part of your workforce, the comparison is meaningless. And if you're not defining turnover the same way, it's useless. So we have that out. We're about to move on to some more ambitious stuff. Just a little bit more on process. The basic rule is it's a consortium, and it's modeled after not the kind of non-financial reporting initiatives like GRI or SASB or did these names even mean anything to you?
No, probably not to our audience either.
See, that's what's so amazing is how completely disjoint these worlds are. To investors, that's what human capital reporting is. Even ISO doesn't get the respect it deserves among investors. So there are these things called Global Reporting Initiative, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board that investors think are the gold standard, and the people who really know literally have not even heard of. Our process is not modeled on those, which are kind of top down, people doing policy or social impact work saying this is what we want to know. It's sort of modeled on technical standard setting organizations. Have you run into those? Probably very few people have. They're from, I'll explain it to you. Go ahead.
No. I'll just kind of speak on behalf of the people in this community here. Yeah, usually if you're doing this type of work, it was through some kind of ESG reporting or, like some kind of like your organization, publicly traded, investors were asking for certain information. Your investor relations office comes to you and you say, hey, we need you to report out some of these measures. And then, maybe a lawyer gets involved and says, well, we're not going to report that, but we are going to report this. And you do it once a year, once a quarter, or something like that.
Exactly. And so what they're drawing from is the things I just mentioned, like GRI and SASB and things. And they don't even bother to tell you or give you the whole framework. They just ask you these rando questions, which is
correct.
Yeah.
Feels very rainy.
They mean nothing, and there's no standardization or nothing. And part of the reason that these organizations don't work is because they're top down by people who aren't experts. In contrast, there are these things called standard setting organizations in engineering and technical fields that are what our model is, which are bottom up. They're particularly common in any engineering field where interoperability is key. So telecom, the web, anything where it literally, if Android and iOS phones can't talk to each other, neither one of them is any good. So you have to have standards.
Yeah.
So we take our model from those organizations, and they're a little bit different because they're a consortium, or it's a nonprofit, but basically, although the standards are free, they're not open in the sense that in order to get access to them, you need to join. And your entry fee is not monetary. It's you have to promise that you're going to be a contributor. And also,
can I say that again? Just because I think that might be the most important part of this entire episode.
Yep.
Which is if your organization is interested in getting involved in the Workforce Reporting Consortium and seeing the first draft of these measures and seeing if your organization can value from it, what you have to pony up is you have to be willing to sign up.
Yep.
You have to sign an agreement to be able to, and I believe you're sharing like public support once you sign that agreement, and that you have to be willing to share your data. Is that correct?
No data sharing at all.
No data sharing.
No data sharing, zero data sharing. You have to put you have to let us use your name, but with this massively strong disclaimer. And we strengthen the disclaimer every time. And our wonderful firm that can't mention, but thank you to them, we have a disclaimer so powerful. It is rock solid that says, we are members of this consortium to help advise and develop, but we have not committed to adopt. And so nobody can hold you to them. You are committing basically to say you are willing to be publicly identified as a contributor only, with a massive disclaimer that you're not a user. And you are willing to actually contribute. And those are the two qualifications. And other than that, they're completely free. You get the actual draft metrics. You can come to meetings. You've got this wonderful peer network, and there's no cost.
So how does WORC help an organization with how they view their data internally and how they look at it externally? And like, what can they do once they have these measures?
I think the biggest advantage is there are all these problems that you can't necessarily, that it's inefficient to solve yourself. That it just doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel all the time for everybody to decide what turnover measure is best.
It's like a tragedy of the commons problem.
Bingo. That's exactly what it is. That is absolutely exactly what it is. And it's just much simpler to have a smart group of people figure it out one. And so you're not committed to it. You have zero commitment. If you look at it and you say, this isn't aligned with our organization, don't use it. But if you find that it solves your problem, that, this is a way of doing it, it's vetted by our peers, and it makes our life easier, then you've got access to that.
So let's fast forward a little bit. If I went, let's say 3 years into the future, what does success look like for WORC, and how broadly adopted could it be, and what kind of decisions is it influencing out in the world?
That is a fantastic question. Thank you. And I'm not going to make a comment on the time horizon. It keeps moving back, but let's say aspirationally 3 years, and we might have to move it a little further.
Sure. No promises are made here.
Yeah. So aspirationally, we have a reasonable number of reasonably sized companies using it and contributing, and at least using it internally. That would be the minimum. Ideally, we also have investors interested. And we do have some signs of investor interest. And I think once we get the investor interest, I think we've sort of got this bootstrap effect. Once we have a certain number of employers, then it gives us a lot of credibility with the investors. We've already got some investors who are, and by investors, I mean the investment community. They're not investing in us. We're a nonprofit. But the investment community starts being more interested. They want to know more. They want to start seeing reporting that's aligned. So that's success for phase one. And then the second part of success is that we actually get the bandwidth to continue developing to the more exciting stuff. Because what we've done now, I think, is very important, but it's foundational. It's the boring stuff, like how do you do headcount properly? Now, I like boring stuff. As I say, I'm a tax lawyer. So what's boring to other people is fun for me. However, I like the policy stuff even better. So I'm really excited to get to when we can talk about economic mobility and things.
This is so fascinating, and I'm glad. I've been waiting 3 years to do this public service announcement, and so this has probably been a little bit less fun, but more informational than most of our episodes. But like you said, you're a tax lawyer. This is what's fun to our community. So this is really cool stuff. Deborah, do you want to join me in Cole's Corner?
I want to join you in Cole's Corner.
Welcome to Cole's Corner. All right, let's start out with some rapid fire questions because I think they're going to pick up right where with what you were talking about a second ago.
Okay.
The first question I have for you is, what is the most fascinating discipline? Law, economics, taxes, or business, and why?
People analytics, because it's the intersection of all of them. Sorry to be evasive, but it really is. People analytics is the coolest field I've ever encountered. And I've been through a lot of different fields. Sorry, it is, because it's painful. It's true. It's true. Because law by itself is a little bit sterile. It's rigor. It's great. That's my answer. You said rapid fire, so I can't say anymore.
You can take as long as you. I wanted to give you a chance to say, like, all four of those were in your background. And most people probably don't realize that when they meet you at at a conference like TALREOS, is how multifaceted you are, Deborah. And I find you fascinating. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of highlight that to the world. And then you pandered to the audience with your people analytics answer. But well done. I'll take it. All right. What is the place you've never been to that you'd most like to go, and why?
It's the national park in the Virgin Islands. That is our family dream vacation.
I mean, what kind of national park is it?
I've just forgotten the name. It's in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and it's a huge national park.
Is it like a mangrove swamp? Like what is in that park?
It's everything. That's what's supposed to be so cool about it, that we're hikers. We love hiking.
Okay.
And it's supposed to be just this enormous number of microclimates, and it's got beach, but it's also got rainforest, and
okay. So it's kind of like a Lord of the Rings tour in New Zealand, where you get to see all the climates in one place.
Yeah, actually, but without a 14-hour, 16-hour, 18-hour.
Yeah. Why do you do what you do, Deborah?
Because I'm a nerd. Because I just love doing things that are incredibly, picky and hard and have a hidden payoff. And this is just, everything I've done falls into that category. And this is by far the most rewarding, because I think it's something that really needs to be done. And I don't feel like I'm doing it. I mean, the people on the team are doing it. I'm an impresario. I'm somebody who happens to be good at digesting. My skill is, as I say, the tax lawyer. I know just enough about the economics, and I have worked with HR data, but I can't do it without all these brilliant people giving me input. But then I can use my special skill, which is the tax lawyer.
All right. I got one big question for you.
Yep.
If businesses started to magically track all the standardized data that the WORC project recommends, how does that benefit employees, employers, regulators, and investors? And who benefits the most?
That is a great question. I think it saves businesses a lot of time doing stuff that is now duplicative and inefficient. So they benefit then, and they get better, more transparent work data, and they get benchmarks data. That's the other thing, is that benchmarking organizations right now, at best, are sort of proprietary and siloed, and we get better benchmark data. So that's one. Social impact is in such flux right now. It's very, very hard to say. One of the things that I would like to do, and I think WORC Principles has always been designed to do it, and is going to be an easier sell now, is focus on economic opportunity in a general way. And I think there has been a refocusing in the impact community towards talking about economic inequality broadly, educational inequality. The question of, do we care? Should we be caring as much as we do about college degrees? So one of the things that WORC has started to do, and aspirationally is going to do more of, is answer those questions which maybe should have been more central in the fairness debate, and I think we can center them now. So that would be the positive social impact I'm hoping for.
What's to stop, HR technology providers, like once you get to a critical mass of companies who've signed up for this, what's to stop them from just making these standardized ways of measuring organizations so that it makes it easier for companies to adopt these standards? Like, why couldn't they do that?
Oh, we welcome that. And in fact, there's one company that, I don't want to say without their permission, but is looking at it, and is probably, they're going to sign the agreement, and they're going to, the hope is that they're going to do it. And they may even offer to do a light version free. So we're very much hoping for vendor buy-in on this. The vendor buy-in would make it much, much easier, because right now everybody has to write their own code, which is another pain. You save money, you save time on the standard side, but you still got the development maintenance. Whereas if you just go into your system and say, boing, it'd be much better.
All right. Want to do some of the articles that I'm reading right now, Deborah?
I do.
All right. Let's do the first one. So this is a post from a recent article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called "Does Counting Change What Counts?"
Oh my gosh, yes.
Fixation, biases, and decision making. And I think you're already seeing why I chose this one, Debra.
I do.
Yep. I'll put a quick ask out there to the audience. A guy on LinkedIn, his name's Alex Edmonds, wrote a quote about this article on LinkedIn, and he's a professor at London Business School. I've actually tried to be getting in touch with him to get on the podcast. So if you know him, feel free to get us in touch. But he talks about that, in this article, does counting change what counts? That people tend to overweight what can be counted, even when it isn't what counts. So in one of the experiments, they found that if subjects had to choose between two candidates for promotion, one has a higher probability of further advancement in the company, and the other has a higher probability of remaining with the firm, subjects chose the candidate more likely to advance when that was the only thing that was quantified. And people chose the person who's more likely to stay with the firm when that was the thing that was quantified.
Totally true. Yep. Absolutely true. However, let me say that this is actually a case that sounds like it might be a case against workforce metrics. It's actually a case for them. Because what we have now is the only quantification we have is from financial accounting. And what financial accounting quantifies is basically labor cost. So the only thing that companies and investors are counting is labor costs. So when a company has a bump in the road, what do? You cut labor costs by laying people off. And if we have more measures, even imperfect ones, of labor benefits, then I think it creates movement in the right direction. Are the measures going to be perfect? No, of course not. Are they going to omit things? No, of course they are. But the right answer to that is more measures. Sorry.
Correct. No, and I want to build on that to say we're in an especially important time at this moment when this episode is being recorded where there's an incentive for firms to do layoffs because investors are rewarding them for doing layoffs.
Correct.
However, if you had standardized measures that, again, called balls and strikes of saying, here's where employees really are costs and here's where employees are adding to the value of the firm, and you had those publicly reported, you could actually show that certain firms who are investing in the things that are like employees as assets,
absolutely,
that those firms are outperforming, and therefore there might not be as much of an incentive to do all of these layoffs from an investor standpoint.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that.
Yep. All right. I think we hit that point good enough. Well, thanks for jumping in there, by the way, Debra. I love the points you're making. All right. The next one that I've got is a post from Jay Van Vebel, which we've covered a few of his, where he covers some research from a guy named Joshua Angris' dissertation called Advisors and Students in the Economic Research Production Function. And more simply put, what he is looking into is they did an analysis of 10,000 PhD students to find what contributes to that PhD student having a prolific publication record. And so what did they find? And I think this fits into the category of what you probably would have expected to find. But I think, again, as Adam Grant always says, it's good to have research that validates what you would expect to find. And so what they found is having an advisor with a strong publication record, plus past students who have a strong publication record, successfully predicts success in having a large publication record.
Yep.
And along with a close student-advisor relationship and publications starting prior to starting one's PhD.
Yep.
So if you want to have a strong publication record, go and do these things. How did you react to this one, Debra?
Well, for a profession that's obsessed with causal identification, that kind of raises an obvious causal question, right? Do you end up with a professor who has those characteristics because you were already going to be the kind of person who had a strong publication record anyway, or did having that affiliation with that professor cause your record? So be interesting to see how the audience deals with how the paper deals with it.
Well, I would get even more meta than that, which is I suspect those professors are probably trying to use that as selection criteria.
Yep,
Is
exactly.
to
Yep.
use that causal mechanism in their favor to make their progeny of students be the most prolific progeny as possible.
Yep. 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 So it's a hard finding to interpret. It's obvious, but not easy to interpret.
Absolutely. All right. The last one that I've got is a complete switch of subjects from what we've talked about in today's episode, which is recent results from a major international test show that the average person's capacity to process information, use reasoning, and solve novel problems has been falling since around the mid 2010s. What should we make of this? And so this is Jonathan Boymel's LinkedIn post. He's a professor of economics. And what they do is they show some charts from a recent Financial Times article showing that science, reading, and math proficiency and numeracy and literacy proficiency in both teenagers and adults is steadily trending downward. And so before I comment on this one, I wanted to get your perspective, Deborah. What do you see in regards to, potentially, shortening attention spans, processing information, using reasoning, and then AI and maybe even, smartphones and all of that?
Can I ask for your thoughts first and then react to them?
Sure. Well, my funny thought is I bet you if you started listening to this podcast from the very first episode till now, that the IQ of the podcast has actually probably decreased over time because we used to do a lot more preparation and do like the topics were very heady and we always wanted to make sure we had the smartest remark. And I think we've pivoted more to the funnier remark rather than the smart remark. And so I was like, we have fit this trend just like teenagers and adults have. But that's kind of where I was going with it. But I don't know. What was your reaction, Deborah?
Well, based on the schooling my kids got, I'm not surprised. The school system is kind of a mess. And I think it's a combination of pedagogy plus smartphones. But I'm not going to, and by schools, I should say, I think teachers get an unfair share of the blame because the teachers at my kids' school were, for the most part, excellent. The problem was the curriculum. And the curriculum has been a disaster. Now, I gather that there's been thank God, a backlash that, for example, my kids were taught zero phonics. I mean, like identity zero. I don't mean like not much. I mean zero. Like in the first grade, they were told to guess the word from context. How can you guess the word from context?
Yeah, that's so dumb.
You don't know how to sound things out. So I think you've probably heard that there's been a backlash that suddenly phonics is back. Same thing with arithmetic. Like, it was apparently considered bourgeois to ask kids to add up columns of numbers and fill out 5. And that's crazy. It's cruel because what it means is that when they get the hard stuff, they don't have the self-confidence to be able to know that the basic stuff comes quickly. So you think you're being nice to them, but you're actually making their life harder.
Yep. But it made me think, well, what you were saying made me think about Goodhart's law, where if a measure becomes the outcome that you're trying to see, it ceases to become a good measure anymore. And I think about that as like we made such a push probably in the last 20 years for, testing everything, standardized tests, measuring everything. Kind of the whole theme of this episode has been, measuring and quantifying and standardizing everything. But what it did from a pedagogical standpoint is teachers, instead of teaching kids to learn, they taught them to the test. And then it became a big memorization exercise rather than an exercise in critical thinking and the ability to learn and accommodate new information. And so I think that as a society, we have to, especially with the introduction of AI and how that's even probably accelerating this trend, if I had to guess, that this is a really critical problem and really questioning, like, if a machine can learn for you, do you even need to know how to learn anymore? Or do you even need to know how to memorize things? Or do you need to just know how to use the machine? And I think that, again, I don't think people like framing it that way, but I think that is a big societal question that we're going to have to answer over the next few years, especially when it comes to teaching and higher education and, for younger kids as well.
Well, AI is going to have to be a lot better. I mean, I love AI. I use it constantly. But it's going to have to be a lot better than it is before it makes it unnecessary to know the subject matter you're asking it about. Because usually what it gives you is about half usable. Now, that half usability doubles your output. So I love it. But you still need to be extremely critical and sift through what it gives you. So I don't think it's going to necessarily affect what people ought to know. It's just going to give them something to leverage their knowledge once they know it.
Well, that's fascinating. You made me think, have you ever heard of the concept of Gell-Mann's amnesia?
Nope.
It's basically like if you read an article in a newspaper about something in which you have expertise, you can point out, like, oh, they got this wrong, they got that wrong, they got this wrong. And then you read an article about something where you don't have expertise and you trust every word of it. You have amnesia about it. And I feel like maybe the same thing's going on with AI, where you can really only trust it when it's about a topic in which you have expertise, but you're going to have amnesia if you use it for something in which you don't have expertise.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good analogy. It's a tool.
I brought you on just to compliment me, Deborah. I really appreciate you pulling my egg out today. I have been such a fan of yours, Deborah, over the years, and you have been, personally to me, feel like such a help. So I just am incredibly grateful to have you on the podcast. Before we wrap up, though, is there anything you want to share or where people can find out more about you or about WORRC or about TALREOS or anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, I guess I can spell out our website. We've got the WORRC website is work.org and TALREOS is talreos.org. And we would love to have you visit both and love to have you get in touch and potentially work with you.
Awesome. Well, you've been listening to Directionally Correct, the People Analytics podcast with Cole and Scott, and today's guest, Deborah Weiss. Thanks for joining us, Deborah.
Thank you so much, Cole.